The rock of the Acropolis is pale gray in the afternoon light, not white, pale gray, the color of limestone that has been exposed to sun and wind and the particular clarity of attic air for longer than any building standing on it has stood. It is porous stone, that rock, rough in some places and worn smooth in others, and when the sun moves low in the west, it catches the surface at an angle that makes every hollow and ridge visible, every ancient seam and fracture, the way old things reveal their structure when the light falls across them rather than down on them. Standing on that stone, or sitting quietly at its edge, the city below would have spread outward in every direction toward the water, the harbor, the sea, the long flat line of the horizon where the Aegean fades into the sky. This is where the story settles, not in the heavens and not in the deep sea, but on this specific piece of high flat gray stone above a city that had not yet been given its name. Before the name there was only the rock, and before the rock had its name there was a moment held in the oldest accounts of the tradition when a god stood on it and struck it with a trident, and everything that followed came from that blow. The tradition that Apollodorus recorded in the Bibliotheca describes the contest plainly, without elaboration or ornament. Poseidon came to the high rock of the Acropolis and struck it with his trident. The trident drove into the limestone, and from the wound it made, water rose, salt water, the kind that comes directly from the sea, cold and heavy with the taste of the deep. It was a demonstration of domain. Poseidon was showing what he ruled and how far that rule extended, showing that even here, far inland, far above the plain, the sea was still reachable through the stone if the right god reached for it. The water rose in its hollow, and it sat there, salt and still, catching the same afternoon light that had been falling across the rock before it arrived. Then Athena came, and the tradition describes what she did with similar plainness. She caused an olive tree to grow from the rocky ground of the Acropolis, not from soil, not from a prepared bed of earth, but from the rock itself, the pale gray porous limestone that was the substance of the hill. The tree rose where there had been nothing, its roots finding their way into the stone, its first leaves already the particular shade of gray-green that olive leaves are, that dusty sage color that seems to belong to dry and ancient landscapes more than any other tree does. The olive tree and the salt spring stood on the same piece of high Athenian rock, close enough to each other that a person standing between them could have touched either with an outstretched hand. Two gifts, two demonstrations of divine power and divine care, two answers to the question of what a god could give a city. The judgment that followed was a question of use. What the salt spring offered was real, water from the sea, the presence of Poseidon's domain made tangible and permanent on the Acropolis rock. But salt water cannot be drunk, and the Greeks who needed water for drinking, for cooking, for the slow, ordinary daily work of keeping alive, needed fresh water. The spring was salt. The spring was, in the most practical sense, undrinkable. The olive tree was something else entirely. It offered shade. It offered wood. It offered oil for burning as light, oil for ritual, oil for anointing the body and preserving the dead. And it offered fruit, small, hard, bitter when raw, but capable of being cured and eaten, capable of being pressed into oil that could feed a person through a winter. The tree that had risen from the bare rock of the Acropolis was a thing of sustained and varied usefulness, and the gift of it was judged superior, and Athena was given the city. There is something quiet in the way the tradition has always held this outcome. The contest was long settled before any account of it was written down. Apollodorus set it to writing in a time already centuries removed from whatever older oral tradition he was drawing on, and by the time Apollodorus wrote, Athens had been called Athens for so long that the name felt like something the city had always had, something that belonged to the place the way the limestone belongs to the hill. The contest is retold not as a drama with an uncertain ending, but as an explanation. This is why the city is what it is. This is why the tree grows where it grows. This is what the trident mark in the rock means when you press your hand against it in the shadow of the Erechtheion and feel its 3 channels worn smooth. It is an origin story told from the far end of the origin with the knowledge of what the origin produced. The sources differ on who gathered to judge the contest. In the account that Apollodorus preserves, the 12 Olympian gods assembled on the Acropolis and cast their votes, and Zeus abstained, standing apart from the count while the other 11 gods determined the city's fate. That abstention is recorded as a plain fact, without drama around it, without explanation of why Zeus held himself outside the judgment. The tradition does not say. It simply preserves the detail that he stood apart, that the vote went forward without him, and that Athena's gift was preferred by a margin the text does not elaborate on. Zeus was present. Zeus did not vote. That is what the tradition holds, and the tradition does not seem troubled by the question of why. A different account, one that Augustine of Hippo cited in The City of God, when he was writing about the gods of the ancient world, holds that the contest was judged not by gods but by citizens. In this version, the men and women of Athens voted on which gift they preferred, and the women outnumbered the men by 1, and because the women voted for Athena, Athena received the city. Augustine's purpose in recording this tradition was not to preserve it, but to use it as evidence in an argument about the nature of pagan religion, and so the account comes to the present moment, refracted through a very different sensibility, a sensibility that read the outcome of the vote with suspicion rather than acceptance. But the variant is real, and the detail it preserves, the women of Athens outnumbering the men, their votes determining the outcome, is particular enough that it has the character of something old attached to it, something specific that does not have the feeling of invention. Both versions share the same basic structure: a contest, a vote, a city with a name that reflects its outcome. The machinery of how the decision was reached differs between them, but the decision itself does not. Athena's olive tree was preferred, and the city that stood on that rock and grew outward from it across the centuries was called by her name. The mortal witness to the contest in the account Apollodorus preserves was Cecrops. He was the legendary first king of Athens, or of whatever Athens was before it was Athens, the settlement on the rock before it had a patron god and a name. The tradition describes Cecrops as belonging to 2 natures at once. Above the waist he was a man, formed like a man, with a man's face and a man's hands. Below the waist he was a serpent, a coil of scales and muscle that moved the way serpents move, in long lateral curves that carry the body forward without feet. He was the kind of figure that the oldest mythological traditions in Greece tended to produce, a being who stood between categories, who existed where 2 things met, whose body was itself a boundary, the earth and the human, the older and the newer, the chthonic world below the rock, and the city that would grow above it. At the contest on the Acropolis, Cecrops stood beside Athena's new olive tree and pressed his hand to the soil beside its roots. When the divine judges, the 12 Olympians, in Apollodorus's account, required a mortal witness to testify which god had acted first, Cecrops gave his testimony. He had seen Athena plant the tree. He could confirm it. He stood between his serpent coils and his human hands on the bare gray rock of the Acropolis, and gave, as a half-serpent king to a council of gods, the testimony that settled the matter. There is something particular in the image of him there, the oldest kind of being, the boundary creature, standing witness at the founding of a city he would never fully belong to, whose nature was already outdated before the olive tree was a year old. The site where all of this happened, where the trident struck, where the tree rose, where Cecrops pressed his hand into the soil and spoke, was enclosed, eventually in stone. The Erechtheion was built on the northern side of the Acropolis, between approximately 421 and 406 BCE, during one of the most difficult periods in Athenian history. The city was already deep in the Peloponnesian War when the building was being razed, and the construction was interrupted and resumed as the war allowed. The building that emerged from that interrupted process was unusual in its form, asymmetrical, and complex in a way that the other monuments on the Acropolis were not, because the building had to accommodate things that were already there. The trident mark in the rock, the salt spring, the sacred olive tree. These were not decorative features to be incorporated into a design. They were the reason the design existed in its specific form, with its specific angles and levels, and the famous porch on its southern face, where 6 stone women stand with their heads as columns, bearing the weight of the roof on their carved hair. Pausanias was a Greek traveler who wrote in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and he visited Athens and described what he saw with the specific attention of someone who had read about these places before seeing them, and was now checking the descriptions against the things themselves. When Pausanias visited the Erechtheion, he described what was inside it. He described the trident mark in the rock, its 3 channels still visible in the pale limestone, its edges smooth from the hands of people who had been pressing their fingers against it for centuries before he arrived. He described the salt spring sitting in its hollow of stone, fed from no visible source, the water still and flat on ordinary days. And he described the sacred olive tree, not a myth of a tree, not a representation of a tree, but an actual tree, living, growing in the place where Athena's gift had first appeared, still venerated in the 2nd century of the Common Era by worshippers who came to the Erechtheion as Athenians had been coming to the Acropolis for as long as the tradition could remember. The trident mark in the limestone of the Erechtheion had been there by Pausanias' time, for something approaching 800 years since the building was constructed, and the tradition held that the mark itself was older than the building, that the Erechtheion had been built around it, rather than the mark having been made in the stone of the building. It sat in shadow for most of the day, that 3-pronged channel in the rock, in the cool interior of a space where the air was different from the air outside, stiller and older smelling, carrying the particular quality of enclosed stone spaces that have been kept as sanctuaries for long periods. When the afternoon light came through the doorway at the right angle, it reached the mark and made its channels sharp, the way the low sun makes every depression in the Acropolis limestone visible, every seam and hollow appearing out of the flat gray surface as though the rock is remembering its own structure. Pausanias noted something particular about the salt spring inside the Erechtheion. When the south wind blew across the hill, when the warm wind came up from the sea and moved over the Acropolis, the spring's surface would stir, and from the stirring a sound would emerge, low, rhythmic, the kind of sound that surf makes when heard through stone walls, when a building stands between a listener and the sea, and only the bass register of the waves carries through, not loud enough to be startling, quiet enough to seem like the memory of a sound rather than the sound itself. Pausanias describes this detail with the mild interest of someone recording a curious fact, and the fact he records is that the spring inside the Erechtheion, surrounded by stone on all sides, at the top of a hill, well inland from the harbor, somehow produced the sound of the sea when the wind came from the right direction. The spring was salt. The spring made the sound of the sea when the south wind blew. Poseidon's gift was still behaving like Poseidon's gift 800 years after the contest had been decided in someone else's favor. There is something in that detail worth sitting with for a moment, not because it resolves into a particular meaning, but because it is the kind of detail that only stays attached to a specific place over a very long time. The spring did not travel. The spring did not become symbolic. It remained itself, salt water in a hollow of the Acropolis rock, subject to the wind, making the sound of the sea when the south wind moved over the hill. And the people who came to the Erechtheion to venerate the olive tree and press their fingers into the channels of the trident mark were also, by the presence of the spring, in the presence of Poseidon's gift, still sitting there in its hollow, still tasting of the deep, still remembering the moment the trident came down. The Erechtheion held both gifts in close proximity. A few meters separated the trident mark from the olive tree. A few meters of sacred interior space in a building that had been designed to hold exactly these two things at exactly this distance from each other, so that neither could be approached without the other being visible. The building was not a shrine to Athena's victory. It was a building that had been made to contain a contest that had already been settled, to keep both gifts present and accessible and venerated, to maintain in stone and living wood the memory of what had happened on the rock before the building existed. The 12 Olympian gods assembled on the Acropolis in the account that Apollodorus preserves, and Zeus stood apart from the vote. The image the tradition preserves is orderly rather than dramatic. The gods did not argue. The vote fell. Zeus, who stood above all of them and could have settled the matter by decree without a vote at all, remained still and apart, and let the count proceed without his voice in it. There is no elaboration in the text around why. The tradition simply notes that he abstained and moves on to the outcome. The gods voted. Athena's olive tree was preferred. The city received its name. By the time the contest was recorded in the Bibliotheca, by the time Apollodorus gathered the traditions he was drawing from into the form in which they survive, the outcome had long been established as the foundation of everything that followed. Athens was already Athens. The Erechtheion was already built, had been built for centuries, and within it, the trident mark and the spring and the olive tree were already old objects of veneration. The contest was not a live question. It had the character in the tradition of something that happened before time properly began, before history started keeping its records. In the deep origin space where gods walked on the same ground as kings, with serpent bodies, and the first olive trees were growing from bare rock. That quality of settledness, the fact that the story is always retold from after its ending rather than from within its unfolding, is part of what makes it restful to follow. Nothing is at stake in the way that stakes are usually felt. The city already has its name. The tree already grows. The spring still sits in its hollow on the Acropolis, and the trident mark is still there in the limestone, worn smooth at its edges by the hands of people who pressed their fingers into its channels across 8 centuries before Pausanias arrived to do the same thing. What the tradition offers is not suspense, but arrival, the feeling of reaching a place that has been shaped over a very long time into exactly the form it now has, and finding that form still standing, Props pressed his hand to the soil beside the new olive tree and gave his testimony, and the tradition preserved that gesture for as long as it preserved anything. The half-serpent king, the mortal boundary between two worlds, between two standing on the pale gray rock of the Acropolis in the particular afternoon light that falls across that hill, with his hand in the soil and the new olive tree rising from the limestone beside him, its gray-green leaves already turning in whatever wind was moving across the hill on the day the contest was decided. He was not an Olympian. He was not one of the 12 gods assembled as judges. He was the oldest kind of being that the tradition remembered. Older than the city, older than the olive tree, older perhaps than the contest itself. And he was there on the rock when it happened, and he saw what he saw, and he said what he said, and the gods listened. The salt spring beside the olive tree, the trident mark in the limestone, the 12 gods assembled in the afternoon on the high gray rock above the plain, Zeus standing apart, still, watching without voting, the city waiting below the hill for the vote to settle what it would be called. The tradition holds these things together without strain. They do not pull against each other. The salt spring does not disappear because Athena won. The trident mark does not fade because Poseidon lost. Both remain, embedded in the same building, within sight of each other, enclosed in the same walls, venerated by the same worshippers who came to the Erechtheion across the centuries to leave offerings and press their hands to the rock and listen when the south wind came across the hill for the low sound of the sea moving through the spring. When Poseidon arrived in Athens in the 2nd century of the Common Era, the Acropolis had seen Persian fire, Athenian rebuilding, the long, slow centuries of the Hellenistic and Roman periods, the changing of what the city meant and who it belonged to and what its buildings were used for. The Erechtheion was still standing. Inside it, the trident mark was still in the limestone. The salt spring was still in its hollow. The olive tree was still growing in its place on the northern slope of the Acropolis, still venerated, still tended, still the same tree, in the sense that traditions preserve sameness. The tree that grew from the stump of the tree, that grew from the rock where Athena's first gift had risen in front of a half-serpent king and 12 assembled gods on an afternoon in the deep past before the city had a name. Pausanias stood in the Erechtheion and saw these things and recorded them, and what he described was not a ruin of something old, but something still present, still holding its original meaning, still receiving the attention and the veneration of people for whom the founding contest was not a dead myth, but a living account of why their city was what it was, and why the building they were standing in had been made to contain both gifts rather than only one. The pale gray limestone of the Acropolis is warm in the afternoon light. The trident mark is in the rock where it has always been, its 3 channels smooth at their edges, its depth just enough to hold the shadow of a finger pressed into it. The olive tree grows beside the spring. The south wind, when it comes, stirs the salt water in its hollow and produces a sound that carries through stone, low, rhythmic, familiar, the sound of the sea, remembered by the rock, persisting long after the afternoon when the trident came down and the water rose and everything that followed began to take its shape. Some things persist longer than the civilizations that made them sacred. The trident mark that Poseidon pressed into the Acropolis limestone on the afternoon the tradition remembers was still there, worn smooth by 8 centuries of hands, when Pausanias arrived and pressed his own hand to it, and found it exactly where the accounts had always said it would be. The olive tree that Athena caused to rise from the same pale gray rock was still growing, still tended, still considered the same tree in the way that a tradition preserves its continuity across generations of growth and pruning and replacement, because the tree was never really about the wood. It was about the gift, and the gift was still there, recognizable in its form, on the northern slope of the Acropolis, inside the walls of the Erechtheion, within a few meters of the trident mark in the rock and the spring that tasted of the sea. 3 traces of a single afternoon in the deep origin space of a city, still holding their ground long after the afternoon itself had passed beyond any human memory of it. The tradition carried them forward because traditions carry what they find worth carrying, and these, the mark, the spring, the tree, were worth carrying. They had been worth carrying from the beginning. They remained worth carrying when Pausanias arrived, and they are worth carrying still, across the long distance from that pale gray hill in the Attic light to wherever this account finds its listener, in whatever room, and whatever hour, and whatever quiet, in the particular darkness that falls when a person is lying still, and the old stories begin to move through the air like something that was always there and only needed the stillness to become audible again. The stump was still warm when morning came. Not from any lingering fire. The flames the Persians had set were long extinguished by the time the light returned to the Acropolis, but from the stone itself, which held heat the way old limestone does, giving it back slowly through the night into whatever rested against it. The sacred olive tree was gone. What remained was a low blackened form at the base of the rock, split and charred, the bark entirely consumed, the wood beneath it the color of deep shadow. It smelled of smoke, and of something older than smoke, the particular smell of a very old tree, reduced to its essential form, stripped of its green and silver, and left as carbon and root. The morning was the one that followed the Persian burning of 480 BCE. The Athenians who came back to the rock to see what remained would have found the Acropolis largely destroyed, temples cracked and toppled, votive offerings scattered, and among all of it this stump. It was not remarkable in appearance. A burned tree is a burned tree. What made it remarkable was what Herodotus records, that from the base of the stump, already visible by the following day, a new shoot had pushed upward into the air above the ash, and the ruin, approximately 2 cubits in length, pale green against the general gray and black of everything surrounding it. 2 cubits is roughly a meter. The shoot was the height of a small child. It had arrived without ceremony, without announcement, in the night or in the early gray hours before the survivors came back to survey the damage, and it was simply there, alive and new and growing from the root of something the Persians had assumed they had ended. The Athenians understood it as a sign. They understood it as Athena's answer to the burning. The tree she had planted, in the tradition they held, could not be permanently destroyed, because what she had given was not any particular tree, but the capacity of this specific place to grow one. The root persisted. The root had always persisted. And from a root that persists, a tree eventually comes. This is worth holding for a moment, not the theology of it, but the physical image. A burned stump, a morning already full of loss, and from the base of the stump, something green, something rising, something that had not been there the night before. The people who saw it had just watched their city burned. They would spend years in the rebuilding, and the first legible fact that met them on the Acropolis was a plant choosing that particular morning to begin. The tradition held that the tree Athena planted on the Acropolis was the first olive tree. It also held that all the sacred olive trees of Attica, the ones called the Morii, the state-owned groves spread across the countryside of the Athenian territory, descended from that original, were in some sense cuttings or continuations of it. When the tree on the Acropolis put out its new shoot in the smoke-tinged dawn of 479 BCE, it was not only demonstrating its own resilience, it was demonstrating the resilience of the entire system of trees to which it was connected. The root of the thing was deeper than any fire could reach. The Morii were not ordinary trees. They were protected under Athenian law with a severity that makes clear how seriously the city took their sacred character. Anyone who uprooted one, or damaged one, or was found to have removed even a stump from land where a morion had stood, faced legal proceedings before the Areopagus, the oldest judicial council in Athens. The penalties were severe. Exile was possible. In the most serious cases, death. These were not symbolic penalties attached to a symbolic rule. A speech by Lysias, surviving from the late 5th or early 4th century BCE, documents an actual trial, a man brought before the Areopagus charged with removing a protected olive stump from his own land. The case is called On the Olive Stump. Its details are ordinary, in the way that real legal situations are ordinary. A piece of agricultural land, a stump that may or may not have been there, witnesses who disagree, a defendant who argues the stump was gone before he ever worked the field. The defendant is not accused of burning a temple or striking a priest. He is accused of removing a root from a field he owned. And yet he stands before one of the most ancient courts in the Greek world, making his case with some urgency, because the law treated the removal of a morion, even the dead remains of one, as an offense against Athena and against the city simultaneously. The sacred and the civic were not, in this case, distinguishable. The Areopagus itself adds something to the picture. It met on the bare limestone of the Areopagus Hill, just below and to the west of the Acropolis, in the open air. Its members sat on stone seats in the rock. Cases were heard at night. The court had jurisdiction over the gravest matters: homicide, impiety, damage to the sacred trees. To appear before it on the charge of removing a morion was to have the weight of the city's most ancient legal institution placed over a question about a single root in a field. That proportion tells you something. The Morii were not protected like property. They were protected like persons. This made a kind of agricultural sense, underneath the religious seriousness. The olive trees of Attica grew in thin, rocky soil, the same soil that produced too little grain to feed the city's population, soil that defeated the kind of broad-field cereal farming that sustained other Greek polis. Attica was not fertile in the way that the Boeotian plain was fertile, or the flatlands of Thessaly. Its earth was pale and dry and grudging to the plow. But olive trees had a relationship with poor rocky soil that grain did not. They could root down through limestone into deep reserves of moisture. They could endure long dry summers. They could produce abundantly in conditions that left other crops thin and uncertain. The landscape of Attica, which resisted so many forms of cultivation, had apparently been made for this one. The olive tree is a slow thing. It does not rush. A young olive grows gradually toward its first significant production, taking years before it yields in quantity, and the oldest trees, the ones whose trunks have grown gnarled and hollow and vast, may be centuries old, may be 1,000 years old, and may still be producing. The trees of Attica that the Athenians called the Morii were not new trees. They were old ones, their roots deep in the pale stony ground, their trunks thick enough that several people could not put their arms around them. Age was part of their character. An olive tree that is very old carries its age, visibly in the slow spiral of the bark, in the widening hollow of the trunk, in the particular way the silver-green leaves turn in the wind, showing their undersides, and then returning over and over all through a summer afternoon. The oil those trees produced was the substance at the center of Athenian material life, in ways that accumulated slowly into something total. It was used in cooking. It was used to clean the body. Athletes at the gymnasium were rubbed with oil before exercise and scraped clean with a curved blade called a strigil afterward. It burned in lamps. It was applied to the skin of the dead as part of funeral preparation. It was a component of religious ritual in the form of libations poured at altars and offerings burned before statues. It was a medium of artistic production used to preserve and finish wooden objects, to process wool, to prepare leather. The list grows the longer one considers it. Oil was not one useful substance among several. It was woven into daily practice so comprehensively that its absence would have been felt in almost every hour of the day. Inside the Erechtheion, built on the northern side of the Acropolis, a lamp burned continuously. Pausanias, visiting in the 2nd century CE, described it, a lamp of gold made by the craftsman Callimachus, burning olive oil and requiring refilling only once a year. The wick was woven from Carpathian flax, a material that tradition described as fireproof, neither shortening as it burned nor guttering in the air that moved through the sanctuary. The lamp stood in the presence of the ancient olive wood cult statue of Athena Polias, the most sacred image in the sanctuary, the one believed to have fallen from the sky. It burned through the seasons. It burned through the festivals. It burned through the years of the Peloponnesian War, while the city strained under the weight of that conflict. It burned as a permanent offering, a permanent fire maintained by the same substance the goddess's tree had produced, offered back to her in the form of steady, continuous light. The image of that lamp is worth dwelling on. A single flame, fed by oil pressed from the sacred groves of Attica, burning inside a stone building on a limestone hill above a city, month after month, the wick not shortening, the oil replenished once a year. The lamp did not announce itself. It did not require attention. It simply burned, as the olive trees simply grew, slowly and persistently, and with no apparent need for urgency, in the way that things with very long relationships to their place tend to do. The oil that passed through the Erechtheian lamp was not the only oil moving through the Athenian world. Vast quantities moved outward from Attica by sea, sealed into large ceramic containers called amphorae, traded across the Greek world for things the rocky soil of Attica could not produce in sufficient quantity. Grain came in from the Black Sea coast. Luxury goods arrived from further east and further west. The economic logic was simple and had been operating for centuries. Attica grew excellent olives and could not grow enough grain. The regions around the Black Sea grew grain and could not grow olives as Attica grew them. The trade moved back and forth, season after season, the ships running before the seasonal winds, their holds heavy with sealed containers. The Panathenaic prize amphorae are among the most visible evidence of how far this movement extended. At the Panathenaic Games, held in honor of Athena's birthday, annually and in a greater form every 4 years, athletic and musical competitors received amphorae as prizes. These were large, carefully painted vessels. On one side, Athena Primachos, the goddess in her fighting aspect, spear raised, aegis across her chest, advancing. On the other side, the event for which the amphora was awarded, runners, wrestlers, musicians, horsemen, rendered in the red and black figure style of Athenian ceramic painting. Inside each amphora was olive oil pressed from the Morii, the sacred trees of Attica, the trees that trace their descent in tradition to the one Athena had planted on the Acropolis at the beginning of the city's story. These amphorae have been found far from Athens. Archaeological excavations have uncovered them at sites along the Black Sea coast, in the western Mediterranean, in places that required considerable sea travel to reach from the port of Piraeus. A victor from a distant city who had competed at the Panathenaea and won would carry the prize amphora home aboard a ship. It traveled as cargo and as trophy simultaneously. It arrived in a place that had not seen the Athenian games, placed there by someone who had. The painted image of Athena traveled with it. The oil pressed from the sacred trees arrived with it, and the distant place received, in the form of a sealed ceramic vessel decorated with a goddess and a competition, a small portion of what Athens understood itself to be. The morion trees from which the prize oil was pressed were spread across the Attic countryside. They were not confined to the Acropolis or to any single sanctuary. They grew in the fields and on the hillsides of the Athenian territory, on land owned by private citizens who were nonetheless forbidden to treat the trees on that land as their own. This was the legal peculiarity the Lysias speech makes visible. A man could own land, could farm it, could build on it, but if a sacred olive tree stood on that land, or had stood on it, the tree was not his. It belonged to the goddess, and through her to the city. The stump of a dead one was still under the law's protection. The root of a removed one was still the subject of prosecution. A man standing in his own field, looking at the place where a morion once grew, occupied a complicated position in the Athenian legal landscape. The land was his. The tree had been, in some sense, his to tend and harvest from. The oil from the fruit had contributed to his livelihood. But the tree itself, the living thing rooted in his ground, belonged to a category the city maintained with unusual firmness. It was Athena's, and Athena's property, even when it was dead, even when it was reduced to a stump in a man's field, was not casually removed. The city's insistence on this had a quality of self-knowledge to it. Athens understood that its prosperity was built on the olive in a way that made the tree's protection not only a matter of religious duty, but of practical necessity. The Morii were not just sacred. They were the source of the oil that funded the prize amphorae that carried Athenian prestige across the Greek world. They were the source of the oil traded for the grain that fed the city. They were the source of the oil that burned in the lamp before Athena's statue. Every level of the city's life passed through them, from the most ordinary domestic task to the most elevated religious offering. Protecting them was not separate from protecting the city. It was protecting the city. There is a quality to the olive harvest that belongs to this section of the year, late autumn, when the fruit has darkened on the branch, and the air has cooled, and the ground beneath the trees is covered with fallen leaves, the color of old silver. The harvest itself is slow. Olives are not grain, which falls from the stalk and must be gathered quickly before it spoils or is lost. They are picked by hand, branch by branch, or beaten carefully from the limbs, with long poles, so they fall onto nets spread beneath the trees. The work takes time. Entire households moved into the groves for the weeks of the harvest. The work measured not in frantic speed, but in steady accumulation, basket by basket, tree by tree, the pile of dark fruit growing through the days. When the fruit was pressed, the oil that emerged had a smell unlike any other, green and slightly bitter, and full in a way that registers not just in the nose, but in the chest. The first pressing from ripe fruit, the best oil, was the clearest and palest. Later pressings were darker, stronger, used for different purposes. The mill that processed the fruit was a heavy thing, a circular stone turning on a pivot. driven by a donkey or by human labor, and its operation was audible at a distance, the low grinding of stone on stone, steady and rhythmic, the sound of transformation happening at the pace that stone and fruit allowed. The press where the oil was extracted added its own sound and smell. Baskets of crushed fruit were stacked under the weight of a long wooden beam, and as the beam was wound down by a screw or weighted with stones, the oil ran from the baskets into collection vessels below. The smell of it rose from the warm pulp, thick and green, and slightly warm from the pressure, and moved into the surrounding air. This smell in the villages and farmsteads of Attica each autumn was the smell of the season. It was familiar in the way that recurring things become familiar, something the body recognized before the mind had finished identifying it. The people pressing oil in the farms of Attica in the 5th or 4th century BCE were pressing it from trees that the law connected through an unbroken line of sacred inheritance back to the tree Athena had produced on the Acropolis at the beginning of the city's history. The myth was not separate from the work. It was the frame the work existed within, the origin story of the material being processed, the explanation of why these particular trees were protected by law and venerated in ritual. The goddess who had planted the first tree remained present in every tree descended from it, in every pressing, in every sealed amphora, in every lamp burning through the night, in every household in Attica. This is what made Athena's gift different from a simple economic advantage. Other cities had productive agricultural conditions. Other Greek territories grew olives without the same mythological freight attached to them. What Athens had was an origin story that connected the goddess directly to the specific material base of the city's life, not metaphorically, not through general association, but through the specific claim that the trees in the fields were her trees, that their fruit was hers to give and the city's to tend, that the oil they produced was a form of her continued presence in the world. The golden lamp in the Erechtheion made this visible in its quietest possible form. The lamp burned, the oil diminished. Once a year, someone refilled it. The flame continued through the months of summer when the great Panathenaic procession moved through the streets and the prize amphorae were distributed to the victors. The lamp burned. Through the autumn harvest season, when the groves of Attica were being worked and the air smelled of pressed oil, the lamp burned. Through the winter and the spring, and back around again to the summer, the lamp burned. Pausanias saw it. He described the wick that did not shorten, the gold that held the light, the flame that had been burning in Athena's presence for as long as anyone could remember. The lamp was lit with olive oil. The oil came from the sacred trees. The sacred trees descended from the first tree. The first tree was planted by Athena on the rock of the Acropolis at the beginning of the city's story, in the presence of the king Cecrops, who witnessed her priority in the contest with the god of the sea, whose salt water could not be drunk. Everything the lamp was, everything that made it what it was, the material burning in it, the place it stood, the building that enclosed it, the goddess it honored, descended from that single originating act. The flame made the connection visible. It burned in a continuous line from the beginning of the story to the present moment of the worshipper standing before it. Whatever version of the contest tradition a given Athenian held, whether they understood it as a vote of gods, as an arbitration by mortal witnesses, as a simple divine recognition of which gift served life better, the outcome was the same. The olive remained, the oil ran, the lamp burned. The trees spread across the pale rocky soil of Attica and produced their fruit each autumn, and had their stumps protected by law, and their oil pressed into the amphorae that carried the name of the goddess, who had given them to the city, painted on the outside in black and red. There is a peculiar persistence to the olive tree that belongs to this whole story. The burned stump on the Acropolis put out its shoot. The sacred trees of Attica survived the Persian invasion, survived the Peloponnesian War, survived the political upheavals and the changes of government, and the centuries of shifting fortune that a city as active as Athens necessarily underwent. Trees that are old enough develop a relationship with their ground that makes them difficult to entirely remove. Their root systems extend through the rock below them, finding cracks and water and purchase that are invisible from above. You can burn what is visible. The root continues. This was the quality the Athenians read as divine in the olive tree, not its oil, not its wood, not any single product it provided, but this particular quality of persisting through conditions that should, by reasonable estimation, have ended it. The tree that came back from the Persian burning was not a new tree. It was the same root, continuing, the same root that Athena had introduced into the rocky ground of the Acropolis at the beginning of the city's history, in the tradition the city preserved, still in the soil below the Eryxorion, still sending upward whatever a root can send upward when the conditions allow it. The Morii spread across Attica carried the same character. Each one was connected, in the tradition, to the original. Each one was old. Each one had its roots in the pale stony ground of a territory that was not particularly generous to agriculture, but was, it turned out, exactly suited to this. The thin soil that defeated grain gave the olive what it needed. The dry summers that stressed other crops were simply summers to the olive tree. The landscape of Attica, which a farmer looking to grow wheat might have regarded as discouraging, was to the olive tree a home. The goddess who had given this tree to this city had known the ground. Whatever the tradition meant by Athena planting the first olive on the Acropolis, the tree she planted had thrived. It had put its roots into the limestone. It had spread through cuttings and seeds across the territory of Attica. It had outlasted fire and occupation and the long, slow changes of political history. And each autumn, in the groves that covered the hills and the rocky fields between the villages, the fruit darkened on the branches, and the harvest began, and the oil ran into the collection vessels, and the press stone turned, and the smell of it rose into the cooling autumn air. The ground beneath the trees in the late weeks of the harvest is a particular gray-silver, the fallen leaves accumulating in the dry soil, their undersides pale, and their surfaces the color of old stone. The trees themselves are slow-moving things in the autumn wind, the leaves turning in unison when the breeze passes through them, showing their undersides and returning a quiet, continuous motion that has no urgency to it and no endpoint. The harvest around them is the human urgency laid against the tree's patience, baskets filling, presses running, oil gathering in the cool stone vessels below the press, clean and slightly green in the slant autumn light. This is where the gift settled, not in the mythology of the contest, not in the legal frameworks of the Areopagus, not in the golden lamp burning in the sanctuary, though it was present in all of those, but in this, the work of the hands in the autumn grove, the slow filling of the baskets, the smell of the press, the oil that had been running from these trees each autumn in the thin rocky ground of Attica for longer than any record could measure, and that would continue running after every record was gone, because the roots were still there, and the roots, as everyone who had watched the stump on the morning after the burning already knew, go very deep. The low sound comes first, before the shaking, before the dust begins to fall from between the stones. There is a sound from somewhere below the floor, a long, slow resonance that moves through the soles of the feet and up through the legs and into the chest, less like a noise than like a pressure, as though the earth has drawn a breath and is deciding whether to release it. The walls of a Greek temple in the 5th century BCE were built from limestone blocks fitted without mortar, each stone resting on the weight of the one below. And in that moment before the tremor reaches the surface, every joint in the building becomes briefly audible, a faint collective settling, a whisper of stone on stone. Then the ground moves, then the dust falls, and those who felt it understood, without needing to discuss it, what had caused it. The earth had shifted under the foot of a god. This was Poseidon's oldest and most persistent name in the Greek world, Anasigaios, the earth shaker. It appears in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey with a frequency that suggests it was not a poetic flourish, but a genuine and deeply held title, one of the names by which the god was actually addressed in prayer and invocation. The title was not metaphorical. The Greeks understood earthquakes as caused by Poseidon striking the earth with his trident, the same instrument he carried in every depiction, the same three-pronged weapon that struck the rock of the Acropolis in the contest tradition. Greece sits on one of the most seismically active stretches of ground in Europe, a peninsula caught between the slow collision of continental plates, and the people who built temples on its limestone hillsides and slept on its stony ground knew the sensation of the earth moving from the inside, the way coastal people know the tide. Poseidon's title was not a name invented at a distance. It was a name earned by experience. To hold Poseidon as only the god who lost a vote on the Acropolis is to hold very little of him. He was old in the Greek tradition, older than many of the Olympians, in the forms in which they came to be understood, and his domains were vast and various and genuinely different from one another in a way that the single image of the trident conceals. The trident is accurate. It appears in all his depictions, and the sources consistently describe him wielding it. But what the trident strikes changes depending on which part of the tradition one is standing in. It strikes the earth and produces a spring. It strikes the seafloor and raises a storm. It strikes the rock and releases a horse from the stone. Poseidon was a god whose domain encompassed things that shook, things that could not be crossed safely without his permission, and things that moved with power across surfaces both solid and liquid. That range is worth sitting with before anything else. The horse is worth considering on its own terms. In one variant of the patronage contest, preserved by the Roman commentator Servius, what Poseidon produced when he struck the Acropolis rock was not a salt spring but a horse. The spring is the more widely attested version, and Apollodorus, writing in the mythological handbook known as the Bibliotheca, describes the water plainly. But Servius's variant is not an aberration. It connects to something that runs deeply through the whole character of the god, a persistent and very old association between Poseidon and horses that the tradition preserves under a specific epithet. Poseidon Hippios, Poseidon as god of horses. This was not a minor or secondary aspect of his worship. Under the name Hippios, horses were sacrificed to him at several cult sites across the Greek world, including the sanctuary at Onchestos in Boeotia, where the offerings were made with solemnity at the water's edge. The horses did not belong to the sea as a metaphor for waves and wild movement, though the visual comparison between a charging horse and a breaking wave was one the Greeks made. The association was older and less easily explained than that, rooted somewhere in the pre-Olympian strata of the tradition, where Poseidon appears in forms that do not quite resolve into the familiar god of the sea. At Onchestos, the image is very specific. The water near the sanctuary, flat in the early morning and reflective as bronze before the light fully comes, holds the reflection of the scene upside down and silent. The animal is led to the edge. The surface takes the shape of what stands above it, and then releases it. What the ritual enacts is a movement between one world and another, between the land where the horse lives and the god's domain below the surface. And the solemnity of it has nothing to do with spectacle. These were not the grand public sacrifices of the Panathenaic procession. They were quieter transactions conducted at the margin between the visible world and the one beneath it, at the place where land meets water and neither fully holds. Poseidon inhabited that margin in a way no other Olympian quite did. He belonged to the edge of things, the shoreline, the fault line, the place where the ground could not be trusted to remain still. The Isthmian Games were held every 2 years at Poseidon's sanctuary on the narrow strip of land connecting mainland Greece to the Peloponnese, and they were among the 4 great Panhellenic games of the ancient world, drawing competitors and spectators from across the Greek-speaking Mediterranean. The sanctuary at the Isthmus of Corinth has been excavated, and what the excavations have uncovered reaches back further than the classical period that produced the great temples and the competitive tradition Pindar celebrated. Remains of an early temple at Isthmia date to the late 7th century BCE, making it one of the earliest monumental Greek temples yet identified anywhere, a rectangular structure with a peristyle colonnade, its roof originally made of terracotta tiles, in a style that influenced later temple construction across the Greek world. To call the Isthmia one of the earliest is to say something significant. The worship of Poseidon here predates the High Classical period by more than 2 centuries, predates the great building projects of Pericles, predates the literary tradition that most people now associate with ancient Greece. The god was being honored at this particular strip of land between 2 seas long before anyone had written down his name. Among the things excavated at Isthmia are starting blocks cut into the stone, shallow, foot-shaped depressions worn smooth by the pressure of bare feet over generations of competition. They sit in the ground now in an excavated field near Corinth, exposed and open, the grass growing around them and the stones weathered to a pale gray. There is something very specific about starting blocks as an object. They record the readiness of a particular body, the moment just before forward movement, the weight shifted onto the toes, and the coiled tension of what will happen next. These particular starting blocks have not felt that weight in more than 2,000 years. The race they were cut for, the race run in honor of the Earthshaker, at the foot of a sanctuary where both the god and his domain were always present in the form of the sea, visible on both sides of the isthmus, is a race that last ran in a world completely continuous with this one, on the same ground, under the same sky, by feet that were not substantially different from any feet standing there now. The smooth depressions in the stone preserve that readiness exactly. They do not suggest what came next. They hold only the moment before. Pindar wrote his Isthmian odes for victors at these games, and the poems move between celebration of the specific athlete, the city he represented, and the god in whose honor the contest was held, with a fluency that reflects how thoroughly these 3 things were understood as part of a single transaction. A victory at the Isthmian Games was not simply a personal athletic achievement. It was an offering, the best performance a human body could produce, given to Poseidon at his own sanctuary, on the ground between 2 bodies of water over which he held sway. The games were serious in a way that is worth naming plainly, not merely competitive, not merely festive, but genuinely religious, enacted at a place the god himself had claimed, in the presence of the sea as both boundary and witness. When Pindar names the god in these odes, he is not providing decorative context. He is naming the occasion's deepest rationale. The Temple of Poseidon at Cape Sunion stands at the southern tip of Attica on a promontory that drops steeply into the Aegean, and it can be seen from the sea at a considerable distance, 16 Doric columns remaining of the original structure, the white marble angled to catch the afternoon light and hold it longer than the surrounding stone. The temple was built in the Doric order around 444 to 440 BCE, and it replaced an earlier archaic structure that had been destroyed by the Persians in 480 BCE, the same campaign that burned the Acropolis. The site itself had been a place of cult worship long before the classical temple, and the excavations at Sunion have uncovered Kuro statues, bronze votives, and the material evidence of sustained offering over many centuries. The accumulation of small personal transactions between individual human beings and a god who had practical authority over the waters they depended on. Cape Sunion is a place where Poseidon's presence needs very little argument. The headland is exposed on 3 sides to the open Aegean, and the sea visible from the temple precinct is not a protected harbor sea or a coastal sea softened by proximity to land. It is deep water, blue-green in the mornings and darkening as the day progresses, carrying long swells from the east that arrive without warning. Vermilion sailors rounding the cape at Sunion were completing one of the more exposed passages of the Aegean route, the southern tip of Attica, marking the point at which the relative shelter of the Saronic Gulf gave way to open water, or at which the open water of the southern Aegean began to narrow toward port. That specific geography explains the votive offerings found at the site with more precision than any textual account. These were not offerings made in the abstract to a god whose power was only theoretically present. The sea was there, visible and audible and physically relevant to every person who climbed the headland to make an offering, and Poseidon's authority over it was not a doctrine that required faith. It was a condition of travel that required attention. The sailors who worshipped at Sunion and at dozens of other coastal sanctuaries across the Greek world had a thoroughly worked out set of practices for negotiating with Poseidon's domain. Before embarking on a voyage, prayers and sacrifices were made, asking for safe passage, a crossing without storms, a departure at the right moment in the season, a wind that held favorable through the crossing. These were not prayers made out of habit or convention, though habit and convention certainly shaped their form. The Greek Aegean has moods that are real and varied and frequently dangerous, and the period from late autumn through early spring, when Poseidon's sea was understood to be closed, when the sailing season had ended, was not a polite fiction, but a genuine response to conditions that had killed enough sailors to make the calendar a matter of survival. The sailing season opened in spring, when the sea was judged safer, not because Poseidon's mood had improved in any human sense, but because the winds and swells and fog banks that made winter crossing so dangerous had withdrawn. The prayers made before departure were paired with offerings made after return, thanksgiving sacrifices, acknowledgments that the crossing had been completed and the god's permission had held through the voyage. This structure of petition and thanksgiving appears across the evidence with enough consistency to suggest it was not optional for those whose lives depended on the sea. It was the grammar of a relationship with a power that could not be compelled or predicted, but could be addressed. The offerings were specific, not merely prayer in the abstract, but the sacrifice of animals at a sanctuary, the pouring of libations over the stern of a ship before putting to sea, the burning of offerings at coastal shrines that had accumulated generations of such transactions. Poseidon received these offerings at many sites simultaneously, at every cape and harbor and headland where a temple or a simple shrine had been built, and the cumulative weight of that sustained devotion across the whole Greek maritime world gives some sense of how deeply his authority was felt. Those who survived shipwrecks made different offerings. A survivor of a wreck at sea, washed ashore, exhausted, stripped of cargo and sometimes of everything else, would dedicate clothing to Poseidon or to the Nereids, the sea nymphs understood as mediating figures between mortals and the god. Hair was cut and pressed into the cracks of cliff-face shrines, or hung on rocks above the waterline, where the dedication would remain until the sea itself removed it. These are very physical offerings made by bodies that had recently been close to not existing, and the physical specificity of the gesture, the particular weight of wet clothing, the particular intimacy of cutting one's own hair and pressing it into stone, reflects how direct the transaction felt. Not theological, not mediated through elaborate ritual. A person who had just survived the sea, standing at the edge of it, making an offering to the force that had just released them. The sailors who did not survive are recorded elsewhere. The Greek Anthology, a collection of epigrams drawn together over centuries, preserving many short poems from the classical and Hellenistic periods, contains a category of epitaphs for drowned sailors whose bodies were never recovered. These are among the most specific and quietly affecting poems in the collection, and they hold within them a particular understanding of Poseidon's domain, not as a space of heroic adventure, not as a background for epic deeds, but as a place where ordinary people went in the course of ordinary commerce and work and sometimes did not come back. The epitaphs note names, home cities, the ships these men sailed on, sometimes the direction from which the storm came. They note that the sea keeps what it takes. The poems are not expressions of bitterness toward Poseidon. They are acknowledgments of how his world operates, written in a tone that resembles neither complaint nor resignation, so much as plain description. The sea does this. It has always done this. The god to whom the sea belongs has his own laws, and they are not the laws of the land. That distinction between the laws of the land and the laws of what moves and shakes and cannot be held still is part of what made Poseidon something other than simply a deity of a particular geographical domain. He governed the unstable. The earthquake and the storm and the wave are not merely large versions of stable things. They are interruptions in the reliability of the world, moments when the ground or the water ceases to behave predictably, and the ordinary structures that human life depends on, the walls that stay standing, the surface that holds a ship, are no longer guaranteed. That is a different kind of divine authority from the one that governs olive harvests, or the weaving of cloth, or the conduct of civic assemblies. Poseidon's domain was not the sustaining world, but the world that could, at intervals, remind you that the sustaining world was resting on something much less stable than it appeared. The epithet Enosigaios, the earth shaker, appears in the Iliad in scenes that are worth pausing over. In the Iliad, Poseidon is not merely the god of the sea. He is an active participant in the war at Troy, descending from Olympus to move among the Greek forces and encourage them, and his movement through the poem is described in terms of the earth and sea responding to his passage. When he walks, the mountains shake. When his chariot moves across the water, sea creatures rise from the depths, and the waves part before him. These descriptions are not atmospheric decoration. They encode something genuine about how the tradition understood this god's relationship to the physical world, not as an observer of natural forces, but as their direct cause, a being whose movement and will and mood were indistinguishable from the phenomena he governed. The earthquake was not something Poseidon sent, The earthquake was Poseidon, moving. In the Odyssey, Poseidon's role is more sustained and, in a way, more revealing. He is the force that keeps Odysseus from returning home after Troy, not because of a cosmic design, not because the story requires an obstacle, but because Odysseus blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus, who was Poseidon's son. The god's anger in the Odyssey is personal and parental and enduring, and it expresses itself through the sea. Storms raised at inconvenient moments, favorable winds withheld, the mechanism of the open water turned against a single man making his way home. This is Poseidon, not as earthshaker in the seismic sense, but as the master of the sea's moods, the god whose personal emotional state is continuous with what the Mediterranean does to ships. The tradition does not seem to consider this an unfair conflation of the personal and the cosmic. For a tradition in which gods are not separate from the forces they govern, the conflation is not a conflation at all. It is simply a description of how things work. Poseidon Hippios, the horse aspect, returns as a thread worth following a little further before it is set down. The myth of Poseidon's role in the creation of the first horse, appearing in various forms in the tradition, sometimes connected to the Acropolis contest, and sometimes standing apart from it, reflects something about what horses meant in a world where they were the fastest thing a human being could ride, the most powerful animal in the working landscape of the Greek world, creatures of both beauty and genuine danger. Horses were not domestic animals in the way that oxen or dogs were domestic. They were magnificent and somewhat ungovernable, bred for speed and for war, and in the Greek tradition they carried something of the divine in their speed, something of the untamable in their temperament. That Poseidon should be their patron makes a kind of mythological sense that is not reducible to agricultural logic. The horse belongs to the same register as the earthquake and the storm. It is power that is not fully subject to the ordinary laws of the human world, that can be worked with but not entirely controlled. At Onchestos in Boeotia, where horses were sacrificed to Poseidon Hippios, the ritual was conducted at the water's edge, and the offering moved downward, from the visible surface of things into the god's element, into the deep and the dark and the below. This vertical axis down into the earth for the earthquake, down into the sea for the wave, down into the deepest register of animal power for the horse, is consistent across the different aspects of Poseidon's domain. He is not a god of surfaces. He is a god of what lies beneath them and what occasionally comes up through them with force enough to change the shape of the world above. The temple at Cape Sunion, built in those years when Athens was also constructing the Parthenon on the Acropolis, stands as a permanent geographical marker of where Poseidon's domain begins to assert itself with the least qualification. The Acropolis is inland, elevated, civic, approached by procession through a city. Sunion is the end of the land. There is nothing beyond the headland but open water in the direction of the Cyclades, and the temple sits at that ending with all 16 of its remaining columns still tall enough to be read from the sea at a distance. The sailors who saw those columns from the deck of a ship rounding the cape in antiquity, seeing them catch the afternoon light and hold it, seeing the white marble against the blue sky and the blue-green water below, were looking at a marker of transition. Behind them, the relative safety of the Saronic Gulf. Ahead, open water. The temple said something about this transition that words did not need to add. It named the god who governed what came next. The marble of those columns has been worn by centuries of salt air into a surface that is slightly granular to the touch. The sharp edge of the Doric fluting softened into something rounder and more continuous. The stone has taken in the sea air for 2.5 millennia, and whatever color the marble originally carried has been slowly removed by that process until what remains is a pale, slightly warm gray, not the white of fresh marble, but something older and more weathered, carrying in its surface the record of the climate it has stood in. On the columns at Sonian, if one looks at the upper portions in the late afternoon light, there are traces of ancient graffiti, names carved into the stone by travelers stopping at the sanctuary over centuries. The name of Lord Byron is there, carved during his first visit to Greece in 1810, and his presence among those names is not an interruption of the ancient record, but a continuation of the practice, the same impulse that led Greek sailors to press offerings into cliff-face shrines, expressing itself in a different form 2,000 years later. The stone received it. The stone received everything and kept it. The Cape Sonian promontory on a clear afternoon, and many afternoons at Sonian are clear, the Aegean light at this latitude, being an acute and particular thing, presents the 16 columns against a sky that shifts from pale blue near the horizon to deep blue directly overhead, and the water below the headland is dark and very far down. The cliffs at Sunion are not gradual. The headland drops directly into the sea, the stone and the water meeting without a beach between them, the waves arriving at the base of the cliff and withdrawing without leaving much behind. Standing at the edge of the precinct, looking south toward the open Aegean, one is looking toward nothing specific, toward the horizon, which is the same horizon it has always been, belonging to no particular country or epoch. It's the boundary between the world that can be navigated and the world that recedes endlessly away from every ship that sets out to cross it. This is Poseidon's horizon, not the civic horizon of the Acropolis, surrounded by the city and bounded by the Attic hills, but the one that opens outward without a visible limit, the one that could swallow entire fleets and give back nothing, the one that sailors read and sailors prayed toward and sailors left offerings against, not in hope of controlling it, which was never possible, but in acknowledgement of its authority, which was always beyond question. The earth shaker and the sea shaker and the hippios who received horses at the water's edge are all aspects of the same fundamental understanding that beneath the stable surfaces of the world on which human life is built, something enormous and old and entirely indifferent to human arrangements moves according to its own laws. Poseidon did not lose the Acropolis because he was weaker or lesser or less worthy of a city's devotion. He simply governed things that cities cannot domesticate. The fault lines below the foundations, the open water beyond the harbor walls, the power that runs in the muscles of a horse and does not fully belong to the rider who sits upon it. The 16 columns at Sunion do not close the story. They stand at its edge as they have always stood, at the edge of the land, above the deep water. The headland below them drops without ceremony into the Aegean, the stone going dark as it enters the sea, the waves taking their time against the cliff face and finding their way, slowly, through every crack the centuries have opened. From the deck of a ship rounding the cape and opening out into the southern Aegean, the columns catch the last of the afternoon light at an angle that makes them briefly very bright against the sky, a flash of white above the darkening headland, and then the ship moves on and the cape recedes behind it, and the open water opens ahead, deep and wide, and already very dark at its center, belonging entirely to the god who was always here before the temple was built, and will be here long after the last column finds the ground. The interior of the Parthenon in the 5th century before the Common Era was not a well-lit place. The doorway at the eastern end admitted a column of afternoon light that fell across the threshold and traveled a short distance into the room before the air absorbed it, leaving the deeper interior in a kind of luminous dimness, not darkness exactly, but a quality of light that was dense and golden and slow, the way light behaves inside a space where stone and air and the smell of oil and incense have been occupying the same volume for a long time. Anyone entering from the bright Athenian afternoon would have needed a moment to let their eyes adjust, and when they did, what they saw rising out of that dim golden air was the goddess. She was approximately 12 meters tall. That figure, offered by ancient sources and supported by later calculation from the known dimensions of the Parthenon's interior, is large enough that it does not quite settle into the imagination on first approach. 12 meters is not the height of a large statue in the way that phrase is usually meant. It is the height of a 4-story building. It is the distance a person might call across to be heard. The chryselephantine Athena, made by Phidias, her body formed from gold and ivory, laid over a wooden armature that no longer exists, filled the interior of the Parthenon from the marble floor to a point near the ceiling beams, and she did this with the calm specificity of a figure who had simply always been there, who had been waiting in this exact posture since before the building was raised around her. She stood in full armor. Her spear rose above the golden weight of her helmet. Her shield rested at her left side, and in her outstretched right hand, held at a height well above the head of any person standing before her, she balanced a small figure of Nike, Victory, no larger than a human child, the little goddess of triumph, held in the palm of the goddess of wisdom, as though this were a perfectly ordinary thing to carry. The gold of the statue was not decorative in the conventional sense. Thucydides, writing in the late 5th century, records that Pericles defended the quantity of gold on the statue, said to weigh approximately 44 talents, a figure corresponding to more than a metric ton of the metal, by arguing that it constituted a strategic reserve. The gold could be removed and melted for war funding in an emergency. The argument was practical, political, and entirely characteristic of the way Athens in the 5th century held its religious devotion and its civic calculation within the same frame, neither one canceling the other, both understood as necessary and real. The statue was an act of worship. The statue was also a treasury. These were not contradictions the Athenians felt obliged to resolve. Pericles oversaw the construction of the Parthenon between 447 and 432 before the Common Era, commissioning the architects Ictinus and Callicrates and placing the sculptor Phidias at the center of the building's design and sculptural program. The funds came from the treasury of the Delian League, a defensive alliance of Greek city-states originally formed after the Persian Wars to protect against future invasion. The decision to redirect those funds toward the beautification of the Athenian Acropolis drew criticism from allied cities, who argued the money had been contributed for common defense rather than Athenian glory. The criticism is preserved in ancient sources and was real enough to constitute a political difficulty for Pericles. He answered it partly with the argument about the gold and partly with the more general claim that Athens's cultural supremacy was itself a form of power that served all of Greece. Whether the allied cities found this persuasive is not recorded. The Parthenon was built regardless, and it rose above the limestone of the Acropolis through 15 years of labor in marble cut from the quarries of Mount Pentelicus. A few kilometers to the northeast, each block quarried, transported, and fitted without mortar into a building whose dimensions were calculated to produce visual effects, a slight inward tilt to the columns, an almost imperceptible curve to the stylobate, that corrected for the distortions of human perception and made the building appear, from the street below, more perfectly regular than strict geometry alone could have achieved. Inside, in that dim gold light, the goddess looked out at whoever had entered and said nothing, as gods do not. What she communicated was communicated through scale, through material, through the careful arrangement of a figure at rest in full armor, a contradiction that Athenian art inhabited with particular ease, the warrior who is also the thinker, the armed figure whose weapon is raised, but whose posture is still. The small Nike in her palm did not diminish her. It announced that she had already won whatever needed winning, and that what she held now was the aftermath of victory, carried lightly. Athena was not only Parthenos, the virgin, the epithet the building carried. Within the city she moved under several names that marked the different registers of her presence in Athenian life, each one anchored to a specific building or object or form of worship that gave the name a physical location and made it something other than an abstraction. Under the epithet Polias, guardian of the city, she was worshipped in the Erechtheion, the temple on the northern side of the Acropolis, built between approximately 421 and 406 before the Common Era, on the most sacred ground of the hill, the place where the oldest stories about the city's founding were preserved in stone and spring water and living wood. The cult image that lived in the Erechtheion was not the gold and ivory statue of Phidias. It was something far older, a small figure carved from olive wood, dark with age and handling and centuries of anointment with oil, worn in the specific way that objects become worn when many hands have touched them over a very long time. Ancient sources describe it as having fallen from the sky, a gift delivered directly from the divine, without any human intermediary, and whatever its actual origin, its age was not in dispute. The olive-wood Athena had been the goddess of Athens before the Persians came, before the Peloponnesian War, before the Parthenon existed as anything other than a projection in the mind of a city that had not yet decided to build it. When Pausanias visited the Erechtheion in the 2nd century of the Common Era, the image was still there. It was still being tended. The peplos, the sacred robe made for the goddess, was still being placed upon it at the appropriate time by the appropriate hands, with the same attention that had been given to this task for as many generations as anyone had been counting. Polias was the name of Athena, as she existed at ground level, within the walls, present in the daily life of the city she protected. Under this name, she received the oldest continuous worship in Athens. Under this name, the Erechtheion had been built around the olive tree that tradition held Athena herself had planted, and around the salt spring left by Poseidon's trident, and around the trident mark itself, still visible in the stone, a building that was not so much a temple as a kind of cabinet of sacred things, a place where the founding objects of the city's divine relationship were kept together so that the relationship itself did not have to be remembered through words alone, but could be touched, or walked past, or seen by lamplight on an ordinary evening. Under the epithet Pramachos, she who fights in the front line, Athena had a different presence on the Acropolis entirely. Phidias made a great bronze statue under this name as well, standing in the open air between the Propylaea, the great gateway at the western entrance to the Acropolis, and the Parthenon behind it. This was not the interior goddess of ivory and gold. The Athena Pramachos was bronze and outdoors, her spear raised in the particular posture of someone who intends to use it, her helmet visible against the sky. Ancient sources report that sailors rounding Cape Sunion, the southern promontory of Attica, approximately 45 kilometers from Athens, could see the tip of her spear catching the light above the Acropolis rock, a flash of bronze against the blue or the gray of the sky at that distance, a signal or a greeting, or simply the largest visible fact of the city from the sea. These two statues, the armed interior figure and the armed open-air figure, were not redundant repetitions of the same image. They marked different registers of the goddess's protection. The interior Athena of the Parthenon held victory in her palm, already accomplished, a fait accompli balanced lightly above the heads of visitors who had come inside to find the goddess at rest. The exterior Athena of the Promachos was still fighting, still turned outward toward whatever arrived from the sea or the land or the air. Her spear not a symbol of victories past, but a statement about readiness, a permanent announcement that the front line of Athens extended all the way up to the goddess standing at its highest point with her weapon raised. The Panathenaic festival, held each year and in a greater form every 4 years, as the Great Panathenaea, was the moment when the city's relationship with its patron goddess became visible as something the entire citizen body participated in simultaneously rather than experienced privately or in small ritual groups. The festival fell in midsummer in the month of Hecatombion, and ancient tradition held that this was the birthday of Athena, though the tradition offers no corresponding account of how a goddess who was fully armed at the moment of her birth might be said to have had a birthday in any conventional sense. The festival was held nonetheless, the date fixed, the preparations elaborate and many layered, and beginning months before the summer arrived. Athletic competitions occupied a central part of the Panathenaea: foot races, wrestling, the pentathlon, chariot races, competitions in horsemanship. Musical contests had been part of the festival's earlier form, and Pericles expanded them during his long period of influence over Athenian public life, commissioning the construction of the Odeon of Pericles, a roofed concert hall specifically to house the musical competitions that were now a formal and prominent element of the greater Panathenaea. The building was large enough that its roof required interior columns for support, and it sat on the southern slope of the Acropolis in a position that associated its activities with the sacred hill above, without occupying the hill itself. Torch races ran through the city at night, teams carrying a flame from the altar of Prometheus in the Academy through the dark streets of Athens toward the Acropolis. The flame was symbolic in the way that many things in Greek religious life were symbolic, not merely representational, but functionally real, carrying something across the distance that could only be carried by fire in motion. The prize for the athletic and musical victors of the Panathenaea was not a wreath or a ribbon. It was a large painted ceramic amphora filled with olive oil pressed from the sacred trees of Attica, the Morii, the state-owned olive trees believed to descend from Athena's original gift on the Acropolis rock. The amphora were painted to a specific iconographic program. On one face, Athena Promachos, the same posture as the great bronze statue on the Acropolis hill, spear raised, aegis across her chest, and on the other face, the relevant competition depicted in the conventions of Athenian ceramic painting, the figures of athletes or musicians rendered in black or red against the clay. The amphorae have been found at archaeological sites as far as the western Mediterranean and the coasts of the Black Sea, carried there by victors who sailed home with their prizes. The image of Athena traveling outward from Athens in every direction across the Greek world and the wider Mediterranean, the oil inside still smelling, faintly and permanently, of the trees on the rocky hillsides of Attica from which it had been pressed. What a victor did with such a prize on arriving home is not uniformly recorded. Some of the amphorae were buried with their owners, found centuries later in graves that contain the sealed amphora still intact. Some were displayed, some of the oil was presumably used, but the object itself, heavy, painted, specific to the city that had given it, bearing the image of a goddess who had chosen this city and been chosen by it, was clearly understood as something other than a container. It was a record of an event and a relationship, the victory it commemorated inseparable from the city and the goddess through whose festival the victory had been made possible and meaningful. The great procession of the Panathenea moved through the city toward the Acropolis, and at its center, in the great Panathenaea, held every 4 years, was an object unlike anything else in the religious life of Athens, the peplos, the sacred robe woven for Athena, carried toward the goddess who would wear it. The peplos was not a small garment. It was woven on a large loom over a period of many months by a group of women called the ergostonai, selected for this purpose, and working through the long interval between one great Panathenaea and the next, the cloth growing slowly under their hands as the seasons turned and the festival came closer. The decoration woven into the fabric depicted scenes from the Gigantomachy, the battle of the Olympian gods against the giants, in which Athena had fought with particular distinction, her spear and her aegis among the decisive forces on the Olympian side. Thread by thread, across the months, the figures of gods and giants took shape in the cloth, Athena's raised spear appearing in the warp of the fabric long before the robe had been touched by festival light or festival air, her victory over the giants becoming present in the textile weeks before the day when the city would carry it through its streets. The peplos, when complete, was hung from the mast of a ship. The ship was mounted on a wheeled frame, and in the great procession it was drawn through the streets of Athens toward the Acropolis, its hull creaking on the stone paving of the road, the mast rising above the heads of the crowd that lined the route, the robe hanging from it and moving in the hot seasonal wind off the Attic plain. It is an image that rewards dwelling in, a ship moving through a city, not at sea but on wheels, the sail replaced by a robe made for a goddess, the crowd watching from the sides as this strange and stately vehicle carried the city's central religious offering uphill toward the rock where the goddess had first planted the tree that began everything. The imagery of seafaring and religious devotion had been wound together into a single object and a single motion, and the city watched it pass with whatever mix of feeling such a procession generates: pride and ceremony and the particular pleasure of a familiar ritual that has been anticipated long enough that its arrival carries weight. At the Acropolis, the procession arrived. The peplos would be given to the goddess in the greater Panathenaea, specifically to the ancient olive wood image in the Erechtheion, the small worn figure that had been receiving new robes for longer than anyone could calculate. The Athena of the Parthenon was too large for a human-made garment. The ancient Athena Polias, small and dark in her sanctuary, was the one who would be dressed. The festival united the city in a way that Athenian civic life did not always manage otherwise. Athletic competitors came from across the Greek world. Representatives of allied cities attended the great Panathenaea. The competitions, the procession, for sacrifice, a great sacrifice of cattle, whose meat was subsequently distributed and consumed, were public and participatory in the way that Greek religious life at its most civic was always public and participatory, the gods not sequestered in private mystery, but honored in the open air of the city by the collected presence of the people who lived under their protection. Athena was not worshipped quietly at the Panathenaea. She was worshipped loudly, collectively, with oil and meat, and painted pottery, and the smoke of sacrifice, and the sound of a crowd watching a ship on wheels move slowly through the streets under a summer sky. The construction that gave the Pantheon its greatest physical stage, the Acropolis is rebuilt after the Persian destruction of 480, was itself a long and deliberate project, whose crowning achievement was the Parthenon, but which included also the Propylaea, the great marble gateway completed around 432, whose wings contained rooms for guests, and whose design by the architect Mnesicles created a transitional space between the secular city below and the sacred precinct above, that a visitor passed through slowly under columns, with the Acropolis revealing itself in stages as they climbed. The approach mattered. The threshold mattered. What you saw first mattered, and what you saw next, and the order in which the different buildings of the Acropolis arranged themselves against the sky as you entered mattered in ways that the architects had clearly thought about with care. The Erechthonion, at the northern edge, was the oldest ground on the hill, and in some ways the most complex building on it, designed to accommodate several sacred obligations simultaneously: the olive tree, the salt spring, the trident mark, the tomb of the legendary King Cecrops, and the worship of Erechthonions, the ancient king whose name the building bore and whose relationship with the goddess was as tangled and intimate as any in Athenian myth. The building's most striking feature, for a contemporary visitor as much as for Pausanias in the 2nd century, is the caryatid porch on its southern face, 6 stone women standing on a low wall, their heads supporting the weight of the porch roof, their bodies carved in the relaxed contrapposto of late 5th century Athenian sculpture, one knee slightly bent, the weight shifting, the drapery settling with gravity into the folds that stone can hold, but cloth cannot quite reproduce. They stand there now, or replicas of them stand there, and they will continue to stand for as long as the stone holds and the hill beneath them remains the same hill. The originals are inside. 5 of them are in the Acropolis Museum, a short distance from the rock. One is in London, where it has been since the early 19th century. The peplos was one thread in a very long series of such garments. The Ergostinai, who made the one carried in a given great Panathenea, had predecessors stretching back through the history of the festival, each group working in the interval between one ceremony and the next, each producing a robe that was a variant on the same essential tradition: scenes of divine battle, the goddess victorious, the textile as a record of something that had happened in a time before time and needed to be commemorated by human hands in human material so that it did not drift out of the reach of the present. The oldest layers of this practice are not recoverable. There was a Panathenea before Pericles reorganized it, before the Parthenon was built, before the Persian Wars redrew the political map of the Greek world. How far back the peplos goes, how many women had sat at how many looms producing the same image in different threads across how many years, is not something any surviving source can say with precision. What can be said is that when the cloth was finished, when the last thread had been passed through the warp and the weaving was complete, and the gigantomachy had achieved its full form in gold and purple across the width of the robe, the Ergildonai lifted the peplos from the loom. The weight of the cloth, the specific smell of new textile in an enclosed room, the lamplight that would have lit such work in the hours of a winter evening when the light outside was gone, these things are not recorded in any ancient source. But the lifting of the cloth from the loom is a moment that can be placed. It happened in a room in Athens months before the festival, in the presence of the women who had made the thing and were now holding it up to see it whole for the first time. The way anything made over a very long time can only be seen whole at the moment of completion, the full image visible at last, in a way that the making of it, detail by detail, could not have allowed. The robe hung in the lamplight. On one side of the cloth, in gold thread on the purple ground, Athena stood with her spear raised against the giants. On the other side, perhaps, the background of the battle, figures falling, the divine order asserting itself over what had tried to overturn it. The women who had made this held it between them and looked at what their months of work had produced. Then it would be folded, or rolled around the mast that would carry it, or stored carefully until the festival came and the ship was ready. Then it would go out into the open air of Athens, into the summer heat, into the crowd and the noise and the smoke, carried through the streets on a ship that moved on wheels toward the rock where the goddess had planted the first tree and where her ancient image waited, small and dark and very old, to be dressed again in the robe that the city had made for her. This was what the winning of the patronage contest had built, across the centuries after the contest itself had been settled. Not a single monument, not a single act of worship, but this accumulated texture of devotion. The buildings on the hill, the festivals in the streets, the oil in the lamps, the gold thread in the weaving, the ship on its wheels, the ancient olive wood image receiving its robe in a shadowed sanctuary that enclosed within its walls the memory of two divine gifts and the testimony of a king whose lower half was the form of a serpent and whose word had confirmed, on the sacred rock of the Acropolis, which gift the city would take and carry into its future. Athena's city was built from this confirmation, layer by layer, across the 5 centuries between the legendary founding and the construction of the Parthenon, and then for centuries more beyond that. The Panathenea continued. The sacred trees continued to grow in the rocky soil of Attica. The golden lamp of Callimachus continued to burn in the Erechtheion, its olive oil replenished once each year, its Carpathian flax wick unchanged, its flame moving across the carved walls of the sanctuary through one season and the next without going out. Pausanias came and saw the lamp still burning. He came and saw the olive wood image still in its place. He came and saw the trident mark in the rock and the salt spring in its hollow and the sacred olive tree still growing where the tradition said it had always grown, where Athena had first caused it to rise from the limestone of the Acropolis, in the moment before the gods voted and the city's name was settled. He wrote it all down, methodically and with the specific pleasure of a traveler who has found what he came to find, and his account has been carried forward from the 2nd century of the Common Era to the present, in the same way that the robe was carried through the streets of Athens toward the goddess, carefully across a distance longer than any single person's life, by hands that understood what they were carrying. The Ergastani lifted the peplos from the loom when the weaving was complete, and they held it between them in the lamplight of the workroom, the full image of the Gigantomachy resolved at last across the gold and purple surface of the cloth. The festival was still months away. The ship on its wheels was not yet loaded. The procession had not yet formed in the streets below the Acropolis. But the robe was finished, and it was ready, and it held in its woven surface everything the city intended to carry toward the goddess. When the midsummer came, and the streets filled with the sound of the crowd, and the smell of the sacrifice, and the slow creaking progress of the ship moving uphill through the warm Athenian morning, the peplos hanging from the mast and catching the wind, the Acropolis ahead at the end of the long road, the goddess waiting inside for the robe that had been made for her, slowly and carefully, over all the months of its making, by hands that knew what they were doing and did not hurry. The Acrocorinth rises above the isthmus on clear mornings like a wall of pale stone against the sky, its upper face sheer and vertical, its summit flattened by the long work of weather into a platform you could stand on and see. On one side, the Saronic Gulf spreading south and east toward the open Aegean, and on the other, the Gulf of Corinth reaching west toward the Adriatic and the edge of the Greek world. From that height, the isthmus itself looks narrow enough to cross on foot before noon, the thin strip of land that kept two bodies of water from becoming one, that made Corinth the most strategically placed city on the Greek mainland, that gave it wealth and a certain kind of permanent importance in the geography of things. The rock is enormous, that is the first thing about it. Not just tall, but massive in the way that only limestone cliffs eroded over millions of years can be massive, carrying the weight of time in their color, their texture, the particular angle at which they catch morning light. What the tradition holds about this place is that the rock itself was the object of a negotiation. Poseidon and Helios, the god of the sea and the god of the sun, each claimed Corinth as theirs, and the terms of the dispute required a mediator. Briareos was called to settle it, one of the 100-handed giants, enormous and ancient, present at the world's making. He heard the claims of both gods and divided what could be divided by the evidence before him. Helios received the Acrocorinth, Poseidon received the isthmus. The high rock went to the sun. The flat water-edged land below went to the sea. Pausanias records this settlement in his description of Greece, placing it among the founding arrangements of the place, the story that explained why the city below the great rock was built and oriented the way it was. What makes the settlement feel true to the landscape is how well it fits the geography it describes. The Acrocorinth catches the light in a way that no other feature of the surrounding terrain does. From the isthmus on a bright morning, the upper citadel glows, catches the angle of early sun, holds it longer than the valley below. Helios's claim on that summit is not arbitrary. The light itself makes the argument, and the isthmus below, flat and sea-edged on both sides, approached by water from the east and west simultaneously, is Poseidon's territory in the most obvious physical sense imaginable, a place where the sea is never more than a short walk in either direction, where the smell of salt air is constant, where the sound of water is always audible if the wind is right. The myth did not impose a divine meaning on the landscape. It read what the landscape had already written and gave it names. The sanctuary of Poseidon on the isthmus was one of the great cult sites of the Greek world, and the games held there every 2 years drew competitors from across the Aegean and beyond. The Isthmian Games stood alongside the Olympian, the Pythian, and the Nemean Games as part of the great Pan-Hellenic circuit, the series of festivals that organized competitive life across the Greek world into a shared calendar. To come to the Isthmia was to come to Poseidon's ground, to the flat land between two seas, to the sanctuary built in the space his settlement with Helios had given him, to race and compete and make offerings in the shadow of the Acrocorinth above. Archaeological work at the Isthmia site has uncovered the remains of a temple dating to the late 7th century BCE, making it one of the earliest monumental Greek temples yet identified. Its stone foundations lie in an excavated field near Corinth, and near them, cut into the stone, are the starting blocks for foot races, shallow depressions worn smooth by generations of bare feet, the physical record of a competition that ran for centuries and then stopped. Those stone depressions are quiet now. They sit in the excavated ground and hold no runners, but the shape of them, the slight hollowing worn by the pressure of feet finding purchase before the race began, carries something that is difficult to name exactly, the particular quality of a surface that was used with great purpose and great regularity, until one day it simply was not, and then remained as it was. The arrangement of the divine settlement persists in the landscape. The Acrocorinth still catches the morning light. The isthmus is still a narrow neck of land between two bodies of water. The stone starting blocks are still there in the earth, waiting for nothing in particular, shaped by feet that have been gone for more than 2,000 years. Across the Greek world, the pattern of Corinth repeated itself in different forms. Every landscape carried its divine history. Every prominent rock, every seasonal river, every promontory where two views of the sea were possible, each of these had a mythological account attached to it that explained how it had come to belong to its particular god, or how two gods had divided it, or how one god's anger at losing a place had left a permanent mark on the terrain. The myths were not decorations applied to geography already understood by other means. They were the geography, the explanation of why the land looked and behaved as it did. To the south and east of Corinth, the Argive plain stretched toward the sea, flat and wide, and in late summer, remarkably dry. The rivers of the plain were seasonal, full in winter and spring, reduced to shallow trickles or dry beds by midsummer, their courses marked more reliably by the pale stones in their channels than by any consistent flow of water. This dryness was noted by everyone who traveled through the region. It was unusual enough compared to the water-rich landscapes of other parts of Greece to require explanation. The tradition that Apollodorus records provided one. Poseidon and Hera had contested the patronage of Argos, and the river gods of the region, Inachus, Cephissus, and Asterion, were called to adjudicate the claim. They ruled in Hera's favor. Poseidon, in his anger at the judgment, caused the rivers of the Argive plain to dry up. The loss of the patronage dispute left its mark on the land in a form that was still visible to anyone who walked through the region in summer, who found the beds of the rivers pale and empty, who could not draw water from streams that had been full only months before. Apollodorus sets this down without elaboration. As a fact of the tradition, the anger of a god who lost a contest, expressed through the landscape, still there. Hera's presence in the Argolid was ancient and immense. The Heraion of Argos, her great sanctuary in the plain below the citadel, was among the oldest and most important in the Greek world, and her association with the region preceded many of the traditions that later surrounded her. Whatever the myth expressed about Poseidon's anger, it expressed something equally true about Hera, that she was not a peripheral deity in this landscape, not a latecomer who displaced an older claim, but something rooted in the plain as deeply as the olives in the dry summer riverbeds. The rivers ran or did not run according to forces that the Greeks understood as divine will, and the divine will that had shaped the Argolid plain had ruled in this account against Poseidon and in favor of Hera, and the land showed it. There is something restful about the consistency of this, the way the Greek world organized itself into a landscape of divine settlements, each one explaining something specific about the terrain it described. The settlements were not always peaceful. Poseidon's loss at Argos left dryness behind. The Acrocorinth's ownership by Helios left the rock permanently lit. Every arrangement carried its own logic, its own consequence visible in the physical world that the gods had shaped. A traveler moving through the Greek world with any knowledge of its traditions would have been moving through a landscape that was entirely legible in this sense. Every unusual feature, every seasonal pattern, every place where the land did something unexpected, carrying a story about how it had been decided. Far to the northwest, on the slopes above the Plaistos Valley in Phocis, a different kind of divine displacement had taken shape at a place called Delphi. The Homeric hymn to Apollo describes how Apollo came to that site and found it already occupied, guarded by the great serpent Python, who held the place on behalf of an oracle that had belonged originally to Gaia, the earth herself. Apollo killed Python. He established his own oracle in the space that had been hers. The transition was complete. The older chthonic presence displaced by the younger Olympian deity, and the sanctuary at Delphi became Apollo's, the greatest oracle site in the Greek world, the place where the Pythia spoke. Apollo's answers from her seat above the crack in the earth's rock, where the pneuma rose from below, and knowledge came with it. The name of the sanctuary preserved the memory of what had been displaced. The Pythian Games, held at Delphi every 4 years, were named for Python, for the serpent Apollo had killed, for the older order that had been replaced. The games were among the great Pan-Hellenic festivals, their victors celebrated by Pindar in verses that have lasted longer than the sanctuary that prompted them. But the name persisted, threading the origin story into the fabric of the celebration itself, ensuring that the act of displacement was never entirely forgotten, that to speak of the Pythian Games was to speak without necessarily intending it of what had been there before the games existed. The sanctuary at Delphi occupied its slope with a particular authority that visitors recorded across many centuries. The sacred way wound upward past the treasury buildings of various Greek cities, small elaborate structures housing their dedicatory offerings, a permanent archive in stone of the gratitude or ambition or political statement of dozens of pulleys toward the temple of Apollo at the summit of the processional route, where the god's oracle waited. Below the sanctuary, the Pleistos Valley dropped away sharply, its lower reaches covered in one of the largest continuous stands of olive trees in the ancient Greek world, silver-green in the light that fell through the gap in the mountains around them. The physical setting of Delphi was its own argument for significance, a place that dramatic, that geographically commanding, that difficult to reach and worth reaching despite the difficulty. A place like this accumulated sanctity, the way stone accumulates weathering, slowly and entirely. The earth beneath the adyton of the temple was understood to be the point where Apollo's knowledge entered the world. The pneuma, the breath or vapor, rose through the crack in the rock. The Pythia inhaled it and spoke. Whatever Apollo knew, she translated into the particular cryptic form that made the Delphic oracle famous across the ancient world, answers that required interpretation, that meant different things depending on how you read them, that were almost never straightforwardly wrong, but were frequently not what the questioner had expected. The tradition held that this quality of the oracle's answers was not evasion, but precision, the precision appropriate to divine knowledge, moving through a human voice, compressed and slightly altered by the translation, accurate in a way that human understanding was not always equipped to receive. What the Homeric hymn preserves about Delphi is not just a founding story, but the trace of a much older layer of religious practice, the earth oracle, the chthonic divinity, speaking through rock and ground, present in the Greek world before the Olympians organized the tradition into the form it later took. Apollo's displacement of Python was the mythological expression of a historical shift, the older oracular practices of the region giving way to the solar, prophetic deity who would become the defining figure of that particular hillside for centuries. The serpent's name was kept. The games remembered it. The temple stood where the older presence had stood, and the crack in the earth's rock through which the pneuma rose remained the same crack, unchanged, unmoved, connecting the surface of the sacred ground to whatever was understood to lie beneath it. The landscape of the Greek world was full of these layered histories. At Olympia, in the flat meadow of the Alpheus Valley, in the western Peloponnese, two temples stood in close proximity to one another on the same sacred ground, their proximity an architectural record of a long negotiation between two divine claims on the same site. The Heraion at Olympia predated the great temple of Zeus beside it. It was older, lower, built at a period when monumental stone construction was still new in the Greek world. Its original form, including wooden columns that were gradually replaced by stone as the wooden ones rotted and were changed over the course of generations. When Pausanias visited Olympia in the 2nd century CE, he found one of the original wooden columns still standing in its place in the opisthatomos, the back room of the temple, and noted it as a survival from a much earlier phase of the building's life. The column had simply been left when the others were replaced, a piece of the original structure persisting inside the later one. The relationship between the Heraion and the Temple of Zeus at Olympia was not simply a matter of one building being older. It reflected a mythological and cultic history in which Hera's claim on the site was prior, in which the valley had been sacred to her before Zeus dominated it, or in which the two divine claims had coexisted in a tension that the physical arrangement of the buildings expressed without fully resolving. The great temple of Zeus, completed in the mid-5th century BCE, with its massive Doric columns, and the chryselephantine statue of Zeus by Phidias installed inside, was one of the most significant buildings in the ancient Greek world, and the Olympic Games held in Olympia every 4 years were under Zeus's patronage. But the Heraion stood beside it, older, quieter, housing its own sacred objects and its own cult traditions, including the Heria, the foot races for women held in honor of Hera, that Pausanias describes as having their own ancient institution separate from the Olympic Games proper. The two temples standing side by side in the Altus, the sacred precinct of Olympia, were not redundant. They were a permanent record of a landscape's divine history, of the successive claims and settlements and survivals that had shaped the site over centuries. To walk between them was to move through time in a specific way, from the older, wooden columned, lower-built Heraion to the newer, marble-columned, more ambitious Temple of Zeus, while remaining in the same sacred enclosure, on the same ground, in the same valley. The negotiation between Hera and Zeus at Olympia was not mythologized into a single dramatic contest, the way the Athenian patronage dispute was, but it was present in the buildings themselves, in the adjacency of two structures built for two different divine claims that somehow both belonged to the same place. The valley at Olympia was humid in summer, the Alpheus and Clydeus rivers keeping it greener than much of the Peloponnese, the plane trees growing large along the riverbanks, the ground soft enough in the low-lying sections of the Altus that the foundations of the older buildings had sometimes shifted over the centuries. The sacred olive trees in the precinct, the kotinos, the wild olive, whose branches were woven into the wreaths given to Olympic victors, grew in the same ground that had been sacred since before the buildings were erected, their roots older than any of the stone around them. A victor crowned with kotinos received not a valuable object, but a living one, a few branches cut from trees, whose roots went as deep as the cult itself, whose presence in the precinct was as ancient as anything human activity had placed there. Out in the Aegean, among the Cyclades, the island of Naxos sat in the middle of the island chain, the largest of them, surrounded on every side by open water. Its interior rose into hills and then into the peak of Mount Zas, named, in the local tradition, for Zeus, high enough to be visible from other islands on clear days, the summit often carrying a cap of cloud when the lower slopes were in sun. The island was known in antiquity for two things above all others, its wine, produced from vineyards that covered its hillsides in dense ordered rows, and its marble, quarried from the mountain's white stone, in slabs and blocks that sculptors across the Greek world sought out for their particular quality of translucence and grain. The divine patronage of Naxos involved a disagreement that some ancient mythological traditions placed between Poseidon and Dionysus, the god of the sea and the god of wine, each with a claim on an island that was both surrounded by water and covered in vines. Poseidon's claim rested on what was obvious. Naxos sat in the middle of the Aegean, approached from every direction by sea, its coasts visible to sailors long before its interior was. An island this positioned, this central to the maritime geography of the Cyclades, belonged in a natural sense to the god whose domain was the water it sat in. The sailors who saw it from their ships would have understood it first as a feature of Poseidon's realm. Dionysus's claim rested on something different and equally present. The vineyards of Naxos were not incidental to the island's identity. They were among the most productive in the Aegean, and Naxian wine was traded widely through the island world, carried on the same ships that also transported the island's marble and the goods brought in from other ports. Wine was Dionysus's gift to the world, and a landscape whose principal agricultural offering was grapes, whose hillsides in late summer were dense with ripening fruit, whose presses ran in autumn, whose amphorae filled with the island's particular wine and traveled as far as the cargo routes extended, was a landscape that had received the god's gift fully and completely. The interior of Naxos, with its ordered vineyards and its fertile valleys protected from the strongest sea winds by the ring of hills, was Dionysian in the most straightforward possible sense. The myth that connected Dionysus most firmly to Naxos was the story of Ariadne, the Cretan princess who had helped Theseus navigate the labyrinth, who had left Crete with him and been abandoned on Naxos when his ship put in there, and he sailed on without her while she slept. In some versions of the tradition, Dionysus found her on the beach. He brought her into his company, and she became his, the abandoned princess of one mythology, becoming a figure of central importance in another. The island where the abandonment and the rescue both occurred was Naxos, in the double event, the loss and the recovery, the human grief and the divine attention, rooted the god in the landscape of the island in a way that was personal rather than merely territorial. The geographical tension that the patronage dispute expressed was visible in the island's actual form. Standing on the higher vineyards of Naxos in late summer, with the grapes heavy on the vines and the smell of the coming harvest in the air, the sea was present on every side, not as a distant abstraction, but as an actual visible surface, blue and enormous, encircling what the vines grew in and rising toward every horizon. The inside of the island was Dionysus's abundance. The outside of the island was Poseidon's water. The two claims were not incompatible. They described two different aspects of the same island, the fertility of its soil and the vastness of the sea it sat in, and the myth that placed them in dispute was perhaps most accurate in suggesting that neither god could fully claim Naxos because the island was genuinely both. What runs through all of these settlements and disputes, the divided Acrocorinth, the dry rivers of the Argolide, the serpent displaced at Delphi, the adjacent temples at Olympia, the sea-ringed vineyards of Naxos, is not competition in the modern sense, not the anxiety of zero-sum outcomes, but something more like the Greek world's ongoing effort to read the landscape it inhabited and give what it read the names it deserved. The gods were not external to the places they claimed. They were the explanation of those places, the reason the Acrocorinth glowed in morning light, the reason the Argive rivers ran dry in summer, the reason the oracle at Delphi spoke in riddles, the reason the games at Olympia were held in a valley with two temples on the same ground, the reason Naxos produced wine that tasted the way it did and sat in the middle of the sea the way it did. The divine disputes and settlements were not mythology laid over geography. They were geography seen from a particular angle, given its proper account. Each of these places continued after the tradition that explained them had been recorded and passed on to look exactly as the myth described. The Acrocorinth still caught the morning light. The Argiva plain still had its dry summer rivers. The slope at Delphi still dropped away to the olive-covered valley below. The two temples at Olympia still stood in the same precinct, the Heraion older and lower beside the taller columns of Zeus's temple, and the vineyards of Naxos still ran up the hillsides of an island, surrounded entirely by Poseidon's water. Nothing had moved. The settlements had held. There is a quality specific to landscapes that have been interpreted mythologically for a very long time. A quality that has to do not with the landscape looking any different than a landscape that has not been so interpreted, but with the density of attention that has been paid to it, the accumulation of names and stories and observations layered over the physical surface of the place across centuries of careful looking. The Isthmus of Corinth had been looked at by a great many people who knew the story of Helios and Poseidon dividing it, and their looking had added something to it that was not visible in the rock and water themselves, but was present in the way the rock and water had been described and understood and used. The stone starting blocks at the Isthmia were cut into the ground by people who understood themselves to be competing on Poseidon's land, on the isthmus he had received in settlement, and that understanding shaped the way the games were held and the way the victories were valued. The valley at Olympia had been walked through by people who knew that Hera had been there before Zeus, that the Heraion was the older claim, that the wooden column still standing in the back room of the temple was a survival of something that predated nearly everything else that was visible from the same spot. Their knowledge did not change the valley's humidity, or the sound of the Alpheus running over its stones, or the smell of the plane trees in summer, but it changed what it meant to stand there, the particular thickness of history present in the air, the sense that the ground beneath the altus had been sacred for a very long time and would go on being so. The disputed places of the Greek world were not diminished by their division or their history of conflict. The Acrocorinth was not a lesser citadel because two gods had argued over it. Delphi was not a lesser oracle because Apollo had displaced Python to establish it. The contested places carried their histories as an additional layer of meaning, an additional reason to pay attention to them, an additional argument for their significance in the geography of divine concern. The gods had found these places worth arguing over. That was itself a kind of testimony. The vineyards of Naxos produced their wine in every autumn of every year that anyone who had heard the story of Poseidon and Dionysus was alive to see them do it. The grapes ripened on schedule, heavy and dark on the vines above the encircling sea, the harvest beginning at roughly the same point in the seasonal calendar that it had always begun, the workers moving through the rows with their baskets in the early morning before the heat became difficult. The island did not require the myth to function. The myth did not require the island to continue producing wine in order to remain true, but the two things coexisted in a way that made each of them slightly more resonant than it would have been without the other. The myth giving the landscape a divine attention it had earned, the landscape giving the myth a physical place to remain, a ground it could be told about and pointed to and visited. Toward the end of the sailing season, in the weeks before the autumn storms made the Aegean unreliable, a ship rounding the northern cape of Naxos and heading for the open water toward the Cyclades would have had on its port side the long run of the island's western coast, the vineyards stepping down from the higher slopes toward the cliff edge, the white marble of the hilltops catching the declining afternoon light, the sea between the ship and the shore, darker blue than the open water ahead. The person at the steering oar might have known the story of Ariadne on the beach, of Dionysus finding her there, of the dispute between the god of the sea and the god of the vine over which of them owned the island that was disappearing behind the ship's wake. Or they might have known only that Naxos made excellent wine and good marble, and was the largest of the Cyclades, and was called, in some traditions, the island where Dionysus had made his home. Either way, the island looked the same. The vineyards were there on the hillside above the water. The marble caught the light. The sea continued on every side. Whatever the story was or was not, the landscape it described was present and persistent and entirely recognizable. The same island that the myth had found worth disputing, still growing its vines above the water, still sitting in the middle of the sea. It had always sat in, still bearing both the god's abundance in its soil and the other god's blue-gray water at every edge. What the Greek world understood about divine disputes and settlements was that the settlements were not endings. They were arrangements, the formalization of what had always been implicit in the land, the moment when what the landscape already was became also what it was understood to be. The Acrocorinth did not begin to catch morning light after Helios received it in settlement. It had always caught the light. The myth named what had always been true. The rivers of the Argolet did not become dry because Poseidon was angry. They had their particular seasonal quality before the myth existed to explain it. What the myth gave them was meaning, the sense that the dryness was not accidental, not merely climatic, but the permanent expression of a divine response to a lost contest, a god's displeasure held in the soil of the plain across all the seasons the plain had since experienced.